Welcome to the 7th installment of the Michigan Solar Story Series, sponsored by GLREA and Weissman. Previous recordings, there are 6 of them, are now hosted or posted on the new YouTube channel, Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association. If you go to YouTube and search for Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association, you'll be able to find them. Additional sessions will be posted there as they happen. Tonight we have Roger Eberhardt coming back to talk about a solar system that powers his home. Please mute yourself until we get to the question and answer period. And with that, Roger, you've got the floor.
All righty. I think what I do is hit share screen here, and looks like it came up okay. Yeah, so I'm a member of the Meridian Township Energy Team, which helped assemble the ideas for the My Solar Stories series. And this is the 3rd one that I've done. I did one initially on a system here at my house, an off-the-grid system that powers an electric car. And the last one I did was a small system that runs some yard tools. And tonight I'm going to talk about the system that I had installed on my garage 1 year ago today, in June 13th, not quite today, but close, in 2019. And so I've got some stats, 1-year performance stats from that to show you. And anybody is welcome to email me at any time if you have further questions as we go along. Later, I'd be happy to hear from you. So rather than start out with numbers, I thought I'd start out with some pictures, spend a few minutes talking about the system itself and the installation of the system. It covers one entire side of my garage roof. And they used black solar panels, so it actually pretty much looks like a roof. There isn't a lot of roof exposed here, just a tiny little bit around the edges. But I would note that the roof was relatively new. It's a standard asphalt shingle roof, but it was just a few years old and in excellent condition. So it was no problem at all to just put panels on one entire side of it. The other side of the garage roof was not available because it's heavily shaded by the trees that you can see in the background. And I've got a picture later on of some tree shade issues that are kind of the hallmark of the system. It was a terrible place for solar, really. I'll mention later on the issues that I had with the way that its system faces and with all the trees that are around it. So it was a marginal location, but in my mind and in my wife's mind, it was definitely worth doing. We're saving a great deal of electricity, non-renewable electricity, by using our renewable power here at home. So I had Absolute Solar install the system, and they came in and put a racking on the garage roof and installed 25 solar panels on the roof connected to microinverters. And I'll talk a little bit more about the microinverters later, but you can see them here spaced out underneath the panels attached to the racking. And the wiring from those goes into the wiring of the house. And a bit later on, I'll mention a little bit more about the electrical power feed. But the key part of this system is that it's solar panels feeding microinverters that go directly into the home's electrical system. So there's no master inverter, and this is all grid tied with the utility that provides power here on Piper Road in Hazlet, which is where I live, which is Consumers Energy. So I had a special consideration here in that the garage is not attached. So the Absolute Solar guys had been ambidextrous with their tools and switched wrenches for shovels and dig a trench running from the garage to the house. It's roughly 50 feet, although those digging the trench might have thought it was more like 500 feet. And in this trench ran the conduit with the power cable that goes from the solar panels into the basement where the electrical panel for the house is. There really isn't very much physical to the wiring of the system. In fact, externally, the only thing you really see is the cutoff, the safety cutoff for the solar system. Everything else is in gray conduit, running either in the basement over to the panel, where there's really nothing to see but a separate circuit breaker for the solar. And in the garage is the same issue, or the same case. So the electrical wiring, although it was complicated by the distance from the garage to the house, and took some skill to maneuver the wiring and get the wiring size and all that right by the electrician, which is Hayes Electric. There isn't really much to see there compared to what there is to see with the solar panels, which is was a very interesting operation. This is a drone shot I had from the drone work that I did while they were installing the panels. And they were very gracious about letting me run the drone very close to them, and they didn't seem to get too worried. This is a kind of an establishing shot showing a little bit more about the garage location. I mentioned trees. It's heavily shaded for the morning by both deciduous and coniferous trees. And as a side note, I ran into an interesting problem this spring with the white pines. I have a lot of white pine in my yard. This is just one that happens to be close to the garage, but there are several other very large white pines. And darn if they didn't dump a huge load of pollen out this year. And not long ago, I sent Rob Karcher of the Absolute Solar a picture of the panels just covered in yellow pollen. They're easy to wash off, but it I'm sure cut production with that very heavy coat of yellow pollen. I'll mention here on this slide that my garage faces, the garage roof here faces west. So again, not an ideal location for solar because normally you'd want panels facing south, but I didn't have a south facing slope. My house is so shaded that it would not have worked at all for solar. But it did offer me a west-facing, the garage did offer me a west-facing roof, which turned out to be okay. I get production, of course, only in the afternoon, which I'll show you later with the graphs that I have. But there's plenty of production in the afternoon, and there isn't much shading in the afternoon. So it's all right. A bit conflicting from advice I've given others, which is to stick with south-facing slopes, but it turns out east and west is okay. And others I know have installed east and west-facing panels and have also had production. I'd mentioned that this little system over here in the corner is just what I talked about last solar story, which feeds the electricity into this shed for my yard tools. But these are the guys from Absolute Solar putting the panels up there. It took them a day to do the racking and a day to do the panels. And then they came back for part of a day later to do the final installation of the information system that feeds the web for information about the system that I can access. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this slide. I took this screenshot about 5 o'clock, let's see, 6 o'clock today, so only about an hour ago. And there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'd, like I said, I'd like to spend just a couple minutes here on this slide. Overall, you can see here in this graph of the day's solar production, a little bit about what happens during the day with my panel system. They begin to wake up and really produce power. Looks like about 11 o'clock in the morning. They start to put out about 2,000 watts of power. Then they ramp up very quickly as the sun gets above the trees and hits them. And by noonish, they're pretty close to maximum. And it looks like here it was about 2 o'clock, maybe 2:30, almost 3, I guess. They're up to around 6,300 kilowatts of power, which is very close to their theoretical maximum, which is 7.75. Those of you that work with solar systems know that you'll never get the full power out of your panels because of all the switches and connections and wiring that that take power. I mean, every switch, every connection, every foot of wire has a resistance to it that reduces the maximum possible power output. So I'm pretty pleased with 6,300 kilowatts of power in the afternoon. And then we taper off a bit here with some shade that comes from a maple tree. And then there's a little blip when the sun peeks out from behind the maple tree and it drops off. But you know, even here at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, actually now evening, it's still 3,500 watts of power, and 3,500 watts is pretty good. It drops off very quickly then, and if I were to take a picture of it again right now here in the evening, it would be back down in the very low kilowatt range. But you can see from this today, the system produced 36.44 kilowatts up until 6 o'clock anyway. So that's compared with what's going on for other parts of the week. We're hidden a little bit over here by the photographs, but or the zoom feature, but you can almost see today's system if I move it a little bit like this. Yesterday was a stormy day, not nearly as much production yesterday, but most days here in June were up in the 30 kilowatt per day range. And then down here is an interesting pie chart. And I don't think I have a, well, I guess I can. I didn't realize I could do this on Zoom. You can see that each month of the year so far, what the power production has been. January is awful, and that's to be expected. We live east of Lake Michigan, and we have clouds in the winter. There's just no getting around that sort of basic issue of life, like I say, east of the Great Lake. There is some snow cover involved, but the snow cover wasn't a real big deal this year. There wasn't a lot of it. This was primarily cloud cover. Plus, if you go back to my earlier statements, this is a west-facing system, and it's just not going to have very much production in the winter. The winter sun is very low in the southern sky. It just doesn't hit very much. February picks up a little bit, double February almost, or double January. March gets to be really cooking pretty good, 400 kilowatt hours. April, we're really waking up the system. We're zooming right along really nicely at 616 kilowatt hours. And by May, we're at almost 800 kilowatt hours and really cooking out there. And June is easily on pace right now to surpass May. And last year, July and August were gangbusters too. So in the course of a year, the system is capable of putting out a lot of power, as is indicated up here at the top, where you can see the lifetime so far, which is a year, is 5.22 megawatt hours. So that's million watt hours of power for a system that faces west and is heavily shaded. And I'm really, really happy with the outputs of the system. And it's fun to watch these graphs. On a cloudy day, this zooms up and down and goes all over the place.
It is.
Very
Appears to be.
So here's the system parameters.
Yeah, just let it cool down.
7.75 kilowatt, and it's grid tied. There's 25 panels with microinverters that change the DC to 240 volts AC. So it can be connected directly into the house electrical panel. It's west facing with the tall coniferous and deciduous trees close by. We like the trees. We're not intending to do any trimming or cutting unless they die. And frankly, the trees on the house provide some wonderful shade that greatly reduces our. Our average monthly output of the system is 438 kilowatt hours, which is very close to what I call the base load of our house.
What?
Our actual use here at the house is more than 430 kilowatt hours because some parts of the year we plug in our electric car to the utility here at the house. And that, when we do that, it pulls in as much as 187 kilowatt hours a month itself. But in terms of our electrical usage here at the house, we're very close here. So we're producing almost all the electricity we need for our home, which is just a 3-bedroom ranch home here in mid-Michigan. Our final capital cost was $14,000. And if you consider only the electrical use at the per kilowatt hour rate, at the 2020 rate, we've got a 17-year payback. But there will be electrical rate increases over the next few years, undoubtedly. And one thing that I think a lot of people forget in terms of payback is that if they do ever plan to sell the house, or when the house sells someday, the solar system is going to add some value to the house. And it's perfectly fair to subtract that added value to the house from this $14,000 capital cost in terms of the payback. So if you only considered electrical cost at the per kilowatt hour rate we pay consumers, we've got 17 years to pay back. But there's a lot of other considerations that go into payback. It's a complicated thing to calculate accurately, and you really do have to talk about all the assumptions that go into that. We plan on being here another 17 years, but it's no big deal. We didn't do this for the money payback. We did it for the environmental effects and the renewable energy usage. Our system is net metered, grandfathered for 10 years with Consumers Energy, and after 10 years, we'll go into a distributed tariff system, and we don't know, of course, what that'll be, but we hope that it's reasonably favorable. So some of the things that we have available online, everybody has available online to help design their own system or to help figure out what they can do. PV Watts is one of them. It's a great website that's available for things up. When we did this with our garage, we came up with some pretty grim numbers, but it's turned out to work out pretty well. PV Watts doesn't allow you to really take into account all the different factors, and our system actually did better than the PV Watts calculations when we used it. I mentioned the Meridian Energy team. They've worked with the Michigan Solar Users Network to set up the Energy Advisors system. And there are several homeowners now with solar systems that are willing to offer advice by phone or email and talk about their system. John Sarver offered his email as a contact for the Solar Energy Advisors, which is here on the screen. And if anybody has further information or requests further information of any level of detail, you're welcome to use the Solar Advisors. And there's a lot of available resources from the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association too. They're the business directory with solar installers, and they advocate for local policies that help solar installers and solar interests a great deal. So by all means, keep track of the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association if you're interested in sort of the larger issues that that affect solar. So we're 20 minutes. The first 20 minutes of the My Solar Stories are sort of background of what the individual has done, and I've talked a little bit about the installation and parameters of my system, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions for if anybody has questions. And John, are you going to do an open mic now? Is that how it works?
Yes, if people have a question, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. There's 17 of us, so I don't think we're such a big group that we can't unmute ourselves and just go ahead and ask a question.
I got a question. If you said it's $14,000, $14,400 for the system you put in. If you had added batteries and had, like on-site delivery instead of in lieu of net metering, do you know how much that would have added to your cost?
Well, I never calculated it for this particular system, but I have for my other systems, which are both off the grid systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to say that in general, battery backup doubles the cost, approximately. Now, there's a lot of variability there, depending on how you set things up and whether it's your only system. But I'm willing to toss a number out there to say approximately double.
Hey, Roger, why don't you stop the screen sharing so we can see the people asking questions?
Okay. Stop share.
Yeah, that worked.
All right.
Well, let me just make an observation. This isn't so much a question, but and it doesn't really help individuals who have systems that let's say face west, but or east for that matter. But overall, the electric grid benefits from solar production coming at different times. And there is talk in some states of actually, especially with the production from panels facing west, because that's closer to the peak of most utilities. Late in the day, in the evening, people come home, they turn everything on after work. And so there have been some states and other utilities that have actually provided incentives to homeowners to face panels more toward the west because it benefits the utility and the overall system. If that sort of incentive isn't in place, of course, then almost everybody is going to maximize their production by trying to face as much as possible toward the south. But that's something that's talked about in Michigan, but we don't have anything like that yet with respect to incentives for west-facing panels.
Yep, good point. Clearly, peak production of my panels is the hottest part of the day when the air conditioner is running the
Question for you: Is there any system set up for power arbitrage where you can batteries can let you sell back to the grid at a higher rate? Was that available for you?
Not at a higher rate, no. So I'm not completely clear about your question, but I don't believe there's anything available that sells back at a higher rate. If we do get time of use rates.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. If we do get time of use rates, then batteries become an interesting option. They weren't in my system because we currently don't have time of use rates right here. But that's an interesting option because then you could feed electricity back into the system at the highest use, similar to what John was just talking about, with the solar kicking in really heavy duty in the afternoon, at least for my system, when typically electric rates would be highest. So that's an interesting option, but no, I did not pursue that here.
Did the cost include any credits, energy or tax credits?
Yes, oh, for sure. Yep.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
To it.
And I took full advantage of those. Everybody who installs right now has a 26% credit on their taxes. When I did mine last year, it was a 30%. And that felt pretty good when I did my taxes.
Great. Thank you.
I think that goes down to 22% next year. But the rest of this year, you get net metering and 26% credit for everything, equipment as well as labor and the electrical wiring.
Oh.
So, and it actually includes really everything. If you have to upgrade your panel, you can include that. There's a lot of inclusions that you can put in that total tax credit.
Is that a federal tax credit or a state tax credit?
It's federal. There are no state tax credits right now for solar systems.
What kind of microinverters did you choose?
These are made by AP Systems, and they are a universally widely used microinverter that's actually rebranded by a number of other major corporations. So when you buy a microinverter from a lot of different corporations, you may be getting an AP System microinverter. And they're the ones that set up the website from which I showed you that graph earlier, that the homeowner can access a wide variety of information. I showed you only a small piece of the information that's available. You can get individual panel reports, which is pretty amazing. When the shade hits the panels, the ones that are shaded go down real low in output, and the ones that are in the sun are real high in output. But of course, the advantage of microinverters is that it pretty much solves the issue of individual panel shading. You can maintain your full power out of the ones that are in the sun. AP Systems, they're reliable. They do a good job. They've got a long warranty, and they have an excellent website for the homeowner. So, and
Roger, looking back on your installation and just everything involved with it, is there anything you would do differently?
Good question, and no. I'm really pleased with the system and how it was installed. The installers did a great job. I don't believe there's anything that I would do differently. I take that back. There's one thing I would do differently. At the very top of the panels, along the very peak of the garage, there's about a 5-inch gap from the roof to the bottom of the panels. And last fall, the maple tree filled that with leaves. So I cleaned out the leaves, and then I went up there and just put some simple gutter guard up along the top to prevent further leaf and seed intrusion from behind the panels. But that's all.
Roger's
Sounds great.
the payback when you mentioned that your system would add value when you're selling the house. Is there a percentage, like if you add a bathroom or you add a kitchen, there's a certain sort of percentage, you get 80% of your money back or whatever? Is there a sort of a metric for solar systems similar to that?
I don't know. John, do you know if there's a system anywhere for that or a metric anywhere for that?
Actually, the funny thing, the research that has been done nationally has indicated they did NREL did or one of the labs did a big study, 20,000 homes, 8 states, Michigan wasn't included. And they actually discovered that the value added was $4 per watt. Now, the funny thing about that, of course, is that nowadays people buy systems for $3 per watt. So does that mean you've actually increased the value of your house beyond what you actually paid? Well, probably not. One reason being that we're here in Michigan and the solar market is not as well developed as California, Colorado, New Jersey, because I think that $4 per watt was actually in states where the market was developed well enough that a lot of people recognize the value of solar. Now, I think that's coming to Michigan because more and more people are putting up solar panels. And so if I was trying to be realistic and objective, what I'd probably say is that, and I've heard some people say that they haven't seen any real extra value selling a house like this past year, okay? I think what will happen is the value of solar will gradually increase over time as the public starts understanding the value. So, you know, if you're going to sell your house next week, you may not get that much extra back because of your solar. If you sell your house 5 years from now, yeah, I think you're going to get a lot of that back. But this is all guesswork. And I think a lot of selling homes too is, you know, what do the buyer values? You know, does the buyer really, the most important thing in the world is what the kitchen looks like? Or, you know, are we going to find that people in the future are more eco-conscious and understand the value, savings value from, you know, a generator up in their roof, and they're going to go, yeah, that's worth some extra money. Time will tell.
Yeah, Consumers Energy provides a monthly summary of the energy usage of the home and the contributions of the solar, so that in the summer months right now, due to net metering, it looks really good. I mean, the solar is producing way more than we're using here at the house, and therefore we're banking electricity. So that looks pretty good, I think, to a potential home buyer looking at these systems, to consider the fact that at least in some months of the year, your electric bill is not only zero, it's essentially a negative.
Yeah, Roger, question for you. I just moved from East Lansing out to the Leslie area, changing from Board of Water and Light to Consumers, and am finding with my electric car, they're particularly unfriendly relative to East Lansing, not having an EV rate, and all of their rate structures are in flux. I've been working with several engineers out there, and looks like time of use will be coming in January 1. But they don't, he said they do not have any tariffs for net metering and EV cars. Have you got any experience with that? Because you mentioned both.
Well, yes and no. I do have an electric car. I do plug it into the utility. I do also have an off-the-grid electrical panel system, solar panel system that charges the car. In fact, this time of year, I'm using only solar to charge the car. But that's, of course, not the case in the winter when I'm pretty much using only utility. I did explore with Consumers Energy options related to the electrical supply for the car. And you're right, they're not real big on that yet. They don't sort of have that figured out. What they did offer was a rebate for a charging station for the car.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with that. I'm moving towards that.
Yeah, yeah. And part of the rebate structure is for you to allow them to access the charging information, web-based charging information from your system, so that they can begin to understand what electric cars do to the not only the grid close, but also generally how individual cars work with charging. And when I mentioned to them that I also had a solar system that would goof up their stats, they became a lot less interested. Because frankly, if you're partly charging the car,
that's my problem.
Doesn't really help.
One thing that, this is, I guess, anecdotal, Dave Conco, who used to be the energy coordinator in Ann Arbor, was living in Grass Lake and a Consumers Energy customer, and he was a net metering customer. And he decided to buy an electric vehicle, and he called up Consumers and said, you know, I'm going to do both. And they said, no, you can't do that. He said, well, sure I can, and you're going to make it happen. It's kind of like sometimes dealing with state government. Sometimes you have to be a little persistent with the utility, but you should be aware that they've done it before. And once the utility establishes precedent, that can be, you know, powerful. That you did it for Dave Conco. What about me? But persistence, it could be a long battle. One thing too I'll mention is that you know, we're dealing with Consumers Energy distributed generation tariff that will replace net metering sometime late this year. And GLREA, along with other interveners, has hired 3 national experts on the value of solar. And so we'll be providing testimony basically that the solar stuff that all us homeowners are putting on the grid is actually quite valuable, and here's why and how. And hopefully that will help with respect to getting a good distributed generation tariff that will replace net metering for Consumers Energy customers. It all remains to be seen.